This podcast series is presented by Archetype. Archetype is an early-stage venture capital fund focused on backing crypto entrepreneurs who are working to accelerate the decentralized future. We lead investments in seed-stage companies and are always open to speaking with crypto-native founders. For more information on our team and portfolio, go to archetype.fund. This season of Cross-Chain Examination is sponsored by Talos. Institutional investors across the digital asset industry have connected to Talos to access the entire crypto ecosystem via a single point of entry. Whether on the buy side or the sell side, from Wall Street's most storied firms to crypto-native come-ups, institutional investors are using Talos to accelerate their digital asset offerings. Talos provides technology infrastructure that powers the full trade lifecycle. Talos' integrated platform supports the entirety of the trading process, from price discovery to execution and settlement. Check them out at talos.com today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode in Season 2 of Cross-Chain Examination presented by Archetype. I'm your host, Katherine Wu. Each week on Cross-Chain Examination, we have on the smartest voices in the crypto industry to tell us what's top of mind for them. The topic of crypto regulation has never been more front and center as lawmakers around the world are waking up to the importance and potential of crypto. In 2020, we saw DeFi summer. In 2021, we saw NFT summer. No doubt, we have entered the mainstream. But as crypto heats up under the spotlight, so do the many legal questions around them. And the ultimate question is how to regulate all of this. And this is harder than ever. There are a very few number of legal experts and lawyers that have seen crypto grow tenfold as an asset class and seen it through the cycles, the ups and the downs. And our guest today is one of these few lawyers. I'm so excited to present our guest today, Rebecca Rettig. She's an amazing lawyer that I've respected over the years. I've known her. I'm lucky enough to call her my friend. And we've seen a lot through these last couple of years in crypto. So a little bit about Rebecca. Rebecca is the general counsel at the Aave companies, which is a group of software development companies that build open source blockchain-based software for the Web3 world. The company is best known for building the Aave protocol and most recently launched Lens protocol, which is a decentralized social media protocol that allows users to own their profile, their data, and their content. With that being said, let's welcome Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a great intro. And yes, we have been friends for a while, so I'm happy we get to take our friendship public on a podcast now.
I honestly, the whole point of launching a podcast is to get my friends on it and we just shoot the shit and we just talk crypto. It's the best.
Yeah. So it's like giving everybody a small insight into your daily world.
Basically. Yeah. I mean, look, everyone already knows why I'm excited to have you on. I think you've been consistently one of the smartest voices. I think you've always had a good perspective on all things crypto, from regulation and policy to the nitty-gritties of litigation. And so I'm going to start off our podcast with a big question. And it's something I've asked before, but I actually think it's a tough question to answer, which is, why is crypto regulation so hard?
That's a great question. There are a number of different reasons that we can go into. So crypto obviously is a huge overarching word, and it deals with lots of different things and people use it lots of different ways. But let's start with why regulation and crypto have not sort of grown on the same path. I think it was such a novel technology. It started out pretty small, right? It wasn't like the internet that sort of boomed onto the scene in a way. Bitcoin was there and crept in. And then, as you said, and in the intro, then there was DeFi summer. And before that, we had the ICO boom. And so there were these few booms that really brought it into the mainstream. And as you said, then woke regulators up to saying, oh, there's something here. And as a regulator who I talked to earlier today said, it is becoming systemically important now in terms of the mainstream, in terms of how much money there is being put into it, not just from VCs, but in terms of the size of the crypto markets. So I think that's been why it's been so hard, is because it's sort of been this novel thing that's had fits and starts. I think the other piece of it, of why it's hard, is what I alluded to before, which is there are lots of different pieces and parts of the crypto industry. And so what does it mean to regulate crypto, right? The SEC is focused on, do we regulate tokens? Now they're thinking about regulating different types of service providers in the space, whether it be exchanges or lenders, like BlockFi and the like. The other question that people have grappled with, and I spend a lot of my time on, is how do you regulate DeFi without really killing the innovation part of it? And then the other pieces of it are what you alluded to before, which is, what do you do with NFTs, right? They're not necessarily financial instruments. If they're fractionalized, do they become some sort of other type of financial asset class? And so what do we do with it? And so crypto has this wide ranging impact, but so many different pieces to it that it's hard to think about a systematic regulatory scheme that will cover all of it.
I feel like, I mean, yes. And then part of, I think, why 2022 has been just felt so intense on the regulatory front is when you think about how quickly the industry has grown. And when you read about certain narratives in mainstream media, which I feel like there's been a lot of, right? There's been, especially with ups and downs. We had a couple of like not so great headlines among like a couple centralized lenders this year. And so like, when retail loses money, I think regulators pay extra attention. And now that the volume and money that's locked in, value that's locked in, also have become so big that you just can't ignore anymore.
I think that's right. And as you said, I think the narrative has consistently been pushed in a negative way, not by the industry. Yeah, there are some bad actors, but I actually have been doing research of late as to other types of innovative technology. So the advent of electricity, the advent of the railroad, like there are always grifters. There's always bad things that happen whenever there's something new where people think they can make money quickly. But I do think there's been a fear of crypto, even from the traditional financial institutions, that has pushed them behind the scenes to really keep this negative narrative going. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us and the good actors in the space to really be pushing the positive narrative and the points of what this can be used for. So even if we haven't gotten to banking the unbanked today, something like DeFi is the only thing that's going to allow for an opening up of our financial system, because we already know the traditional financial system won't do that. So pushing the narratives of the promise of this technology is really, really important.
Oh, I actually can't agree more. Like, if mainstream is pushing negative, it's on the industries. And when I say industry, I don't mean just like people who've been in crypto for years. It's also like the bigger brands that come into crypto this year. And I've been telling brands, I'm like, you have the resource and agency in house to basically build out your own narratives. And like these narratives are like around use cases. So, for example, if you're a big brand getting into NFTs, why, right? Like, talk about the why, talk about the financial inclusion. With DeFi, it's like, yeah, go beyond the numbers, go beyond TVL, like talk about real people whose lives this has impacted for the better. And I just feel like that specific narrative is just a little lacking right now.
Yeah.
Not that it can't be changed, but
Yeah. And look, I think especially with DeFi, it's very much like we're in DeFi now, we're building to 2.0, but we're in like 1.5 right now. Like different versions of protocols have come out that have cool and interesting risk mitigation features and are becoming more sophisticated on that sort of things. But the financial primitives that are being built with DeFi and the use cases that go from there, right? Like on-chain credit scoring, that's going to be really important. Finding ways to tokenize off-chain assets and use them in DeFi, I definitely think is a really important use case that can help DeFi explode a little and also bring in different players that may not have been able to be included in the traditional financial markets. So even looking ahead and talking about the use cases that can and are being built but may not be built today is super important.
yeah. So I think the other thing that's been hard about regulation, and I don't know if you have any more perspective on this, but I feel like, at least in the US, which is where the both of us are, lawmakers on the federal and state level have come out with, draft legislation, bills, this and that. Even the White House have put out frameworks. But like to me, when I read it, what I feel like it certainly makes sense, I guess, maybe from the lawmakers' perspective, but it feels to me like there's just a lack of dialogue with people who are actually in the industry. So like when you read some of the bills and I read it and I'm like, I don't know if this is actually feasible. And if you actually talk to anybody in the industry, they probably would have said the same thing. Why is there such a big disconnect?
I think that's hard. So I will say that there are a number of really dedicated people in the space, not just on the policy side, but also even within builders who are trying to do good policy work and make sure that any regulation is informed by what the technology really does. I think for CeFi, right, building out regulations a little easier. They're models we know and are comfortable with. It's just with a different type of asset class. So we need to put those forward. And I think those are what we can be comfortable with. But I think what you're talking about are things more like, what do we do with stable coins? Okay, centralized stable, payment stable coins, as we've heard it referred to with respect to the draft legislation that was discussed a few weeks ago for people, like USD, Circle, whatever. Those may make more sense. But for this really novel technology that may get captured by some of this broad language in these bills, that's very problematic. And I've been saying for a long time, I think that DeFi builders or people who understand sort of the more cutting edge technology need to be engaging with regulators and policymakers. This was something that Stani, our CEO, really thought of as an important mandate when he brought me into the company to make sure we were doing it. So I do speak to policymakers in the US, the UK, and the EU on a pretty regular basis. But I think that There are a couple different things. So regulators across the world think same risk, same regulation, right? That's something that's been said in the US, UK, and a little bit in the EU. But it's very hard to explain and hard for people to process that something like DeFi doesn't have the same risk because of how it's built, right? So over collateralization and liquidations in the Aave protocol actually take care of some of the risks that happen in traditional financial transactions, that you do not have a counterparty and that all transactions are peer to protocol instead of peer to peer, and something like the Aave protocol mitigates counterparty risk. And so taking the time to explain that something that looks so similar to what we're all used to seeing in the traditional world, but actually works so differently, is really hard for people to get their mind around. I did a big presentation to policymakers a few months ago, and somebody just point blank said, like, I don't get it. I don't get how it works. And so it's really important and incumbent upon all of us to make the more novel and sort of bleeding edge technology cases understandable for regular people. And I'm including policymakers in that category too. And just making the language we use when we talk about it a lot more accessible. And to spend the time, instead of doing, a long Twitter thread, but really to engage, to explain why something should be treated differently because the risks are somewhat different. And so the regulations can be built out. I think the other piece of it is, especially in things Web3, DeFi as it is, you have builders, but then in theory, when you get to a fully decentralized state, who's responsible if something goes wrong is something that we really have to work on as an industry and fixing. We built something called the safety module, which is a complementary piece of software to the Aave protocol that is meant to backstop in the case of a shortfall event. It's controlled by the Aave DAO, so it's all governance. And when I talk about that to policymakers and explain that there are technology-based mechanisms that will do what actors in the traditional space do, that's compelling. But we have to have those examples and present them for people to get their mind around why it may not be same risk, same regulation.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And then the other thing that I was thinking of when I was even like writing this question, what is one thing that I tell my founders when they're like, oh, how do I find my customer? How do I reach my target demo? And I always say to them, like, well, you have to go where they are, right? I think especially with crypto, like, sure, write Twitter threads, like explain how things work. But if you actually talk to people in DC, the overlap with DC Twitter and crypto Twitter is actually very minimal, if not just like barely there. And so I think you're in a great position because you're at like a blue chip company. I think you have access to lawmakers. And I think having you as a voice is really important before, maybe people who don't necessarily do that, but want to get involved, like start thinking about like, okay, can you start like submitting op-eds into like print newspaper? Because that's probably where people read stuff and like get their opinions from. And like, you can hate on mainstream media, but like you can also contribute to changing that a little bit. So I don't know. I was like actually thinking a little bit about that. And that kind of like contributes to like bridging the gap.
Yes, look, bridging the gap between builders and politicians is very, very different. And it's actually how I try to think about my role, right? It's not like, oh, I'm writing policy. It's like, I'm educating about how the technology really works, which will then let people write, hopefully, good regulation that will allow the technology to thrive and things like that. And I will say, just so people are aware, definitely politicians and other people in DC do read crypto Twitter. So everyone should be very mindful of that. But I think those two things are really important. I think the last thing that everybody has to accept is, as much as we all want to live in a permissionless DeFi or permissionless Web3 utopia, me included, by the way, like I got into this because I thought the tech was cool and very fun and creative and all of those good things. And I think there are a lot of crypto native ways that we can hopefully build out regulation, but we're not going to live in a regulationless utopia as much as we want to. And so there has to be an acceptance a little bit that regulation is coming, and our best bet is to try to make it as reasonable as possible so that everybody can keep innovating and that we don't turn software developers into financial intermediaries.
That would be just terrible. Okay, so let's say, okay, regulation is coming. We all want to be good actors. We also need some standards. We need some frameworks to talk about it. And so in my spare time, I consult with CCI, and they do a lot of policy engagements with lawmakers around the world. And I was talking to one of my colleagues there. We were actually talking about the prongs of decentralization, right? We're like, okay, well, if we need these frameworks and standards for the industry, like what should we be looking at? And she asked me, she was like, have you heard of the Rebecca test? And I was like, the what test? And she said, well, Rebecca Rettig, like the Rebecca test. And I said, well, I know Rebecca. I don't know if I know this test. And she was like,
I don't know the Rebecca test.
well, there is a Rebecca test,
yeah,
as people say it. And so she told me to look up your talk from ECC, but I wanted you to like tell our listeners about the Rebecca test.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the Rebecca test goes to the prongs, as you said, of decentralization. And my talk at ECC was really about what you're talking about, which was bridging the gap between builders and policymakers. And while I believe I have to do it on the policymaking side, I also think we have to do it on the builder side too. Because, right, some of the sticky parts of this past year have been people indiscriminately using the term DeFi when they're not DeFi at all, right? Like Terra wasn't DeFi, it was very, centralized, things like that. And so my talk at ECC was about decentralization and also about, regulation is coming. So the three prongs of decentralization that I think about is technological, governance, and ecosystem or community. And so technological, is your protocol open sourced? Can you understand where everything is, why it all happens, and can anyone use it, right? The transparency of DeFi is really, really important. And if you cannot see and understand all parts of a DeFi protocol, it means that there's a piece of it that's centralized, right? So the open source nature of the protocol and making sure you can see how it works is really important. The second part is governance, right? DAOs. Do you have some sort of decentralized or dispersed governance system? Who holds the admin key, right? Who can control things? Is there this centralized actor, or is it a highly decentralized mode of decision making without coordination, as we're used to in sort of the traditional world? And the last part is ecosystem or community. And is the original software developer the person who's really driving the protocol and its ecosystem forward, or is it really dispersed in a real way? And that's really important because it goes to a few different prongs. It goes to the issue of efforts of others in the Howey test, but it also is if there's a perception from the community that a DeFi builder or just a general builder is the one who's ultimately responsible and controlling things, the perception is important, especially when you're dealing with economic transactions. And so to know that there's a very dispersed and decentralized ecosystem, I think is really important for there to be true decentralization as well.
Is there somewhere where people can look up your talk? Can you give me a link later?
Yeah, I'll give you a link to put in the show notes. There's the ECC website has all the talks, and a lot of them were so great and really forward thinking. And there was a big presentation on Lens and stuff, so people can definitely go to the ECC website and see all those good things.
Awesome. So, I want this show to not be so focused on current events, but I do think this is important to touch on, which is in the last couple of weeks, the CFTC had an enforcement action against Ooki DAO. I think a lot of people were worried about what it means in general for the future of DAOs, if this is an outlier. For the folks unfamiliar, can you just quickly summarize the enforcement action and like kind of the takeaways? And also, I think like the takeaways in light of the three prongs that you laid out for us just now.
Sure. So there were two pieces to this case against BZX/Ooki DAO. BZX is the predecessor to Ooki. There's the BZX protocol and then the BZX DAO or the Ooki DAO. There was a settlement with the founders of BZX, and that was for creating and running a business where the protocol would allow for margin or leveraged trading. In the United States, the CFTC requires that any business who is offering margin or leverage to U.S. persons be registered with the CFTC. And the basis of the enforcement order against the founders was that they had run a business but never had registered the business with the CFTC as was required. And so they didn't have all the necessary protection mechanisms, including a BSA compliance program and the like, that were required. The interesting part, and this goes to what I will go into on the complaint, is they settled all parts of the liability with the founders. The founders were highly involved in the DAO when they launched it, but they can't hold the founders liable. That was all settled in the enforcement order. The enforcement action against Ooki DAO is in the Northern District of California in front of a judge named Judge Orrick, who has actually seen a number of crypto, or at least one big crypto case in the past. So he's not a stranger to crypto. And the case basically tries to allege that the DAO, in theory, was also running a business that allowed for margin or leverage trading, and it allowed it to U.S. persons without the DAO being registered as running a business. They allege in paragraph 49 of their complaint that members of the DAO were in the United States, but they never go on to list who they were. I think that there are a few really complicated pieces. I think they are trying to send a message on decentralization. And they don't get into how many members of the DAO there are, but I do think the fact that the founders were so involved in running the DAO is an important piece that everyone should sort of take note of. But with the founders running the DAO, they basically were like, you're just using a DAO as a front for your business. So that's a very important piece of all the pieces of certainly the governance piece and the ecosystem piece of the Rebecca test. That's really important. But I think this is going to be a very complex case because they just tried to serve process, which means like serve a copy of the complaint on the DAO by posting it on the governance forum and then also serving it to a chat box, which is very novel, I suppose. And they tried to assert that they couldn't find any members of the DAO. I would challenge that assertion given all the tools we have and all the tools they have at their disposal and how transparent and even pseudonymous wallets may be, especially with ENS names and things like that. And their theory is that only members of the DAO who voted are the ones who can be liable for this idea of running the business. So you could hold tokens and never have voted and somehow not be liable, but it's only if you voted. And so to say that these DAO members were liable for running a business is going to be complicated because a business has so many different pieces to it. We have to look at the fee mechanism. Did members of the DAO take fees? Was this really a corporation or other association? It's a lot of complex things. But look, I will say that this action and a lot of the CFTC actions, no matter what you think about them, are trying to send messages on decentralization. And this is in my ECC talk too, which is, will decentralization be enough in a regulatory context? And my answer is, and this is why I really wanted to give this talk to a bunch of builders at ECC, is true decentralization, maybe. But this sort of halfway decentralization, not really. And I don't think you can be fully decentralized out of the gate, but I think you have to have a plan for what true decentralization looks like and make sure you're being active about putting that into place. Because even in the SEC complaints that have come out, that insider trading case where they said 9 tokens were securities, they lay out all the different pieces of the Howey test and why what the projects were doing around the tokens meet the Howey test and make those tokens a security. Do I agree with how the SEC approached that case like that without bringing the builders in? No, definitely not. I think there's a lot that the SEC has been doing in terms of trying to give guidance through sort of backhanded statements in complaints. And like, that's not the guidance the industry has actually been looking for. They want to be able to rely on something and not just unproven allegations in a complaint. But I think that people need to take decentralization seriously.
Yeah. And I like what you said, which is like a very realistic approach, which is that you're realistically not going to be decentralized out of the gates. But like, I think where the issue gets hairy is when you are operating in this weird middle ground, which is not so middle, it's actually very centralized forever. And nobody really knows, like, do you actually have a plan to decentralize yourself, right? And I say this all the time to teams that, want to do something in crypto and they want to form a DAO. And I'm like, okay, you have to sign up for understanding that if you want to do a DAO, your users, your token holders can potentially fire you one day. And when I say that, I just mean like, are you ready to decentralize yourself, right? As like the team behind it or like as the core member behind it. And like, that's what true governance looks like. Yeah, you can't, it's not a real DAO if you give people false choices like, hey, should I make the heading, black or red? Like that's a false choice. A real choice is like, are you decentralizing like decision-making power?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And look, there are a lot of different ways to do DAOs. And I think the other thing that we can all be building is sort of better governance, right? I think we're stagnated in some ways in our ideas of governance. I just had a conversation the other day about optimistic voting, right? Where the proposal passes and you can have veto power. I listened to a podcast a few months ago about governance mining, where people get rewarded for participating in governance. So I think there's a lot here and that can be done. And that's the other thing that I try to say a lot to policymakers is like, and I don't say that like we're still early, but I do say like we're still in an R&D phase. Like you should not be treating this as like an industry that's done, right? And now you need to figure out what to do with it. And so that's why good and responsible and thoughtful regulation is more important than ever, because if you do it wrong, you could kill an industry before it's really even truly off the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I think both sides just tread a little careful. Like we got in for the tech, we got in for the ideals, and like so it's near and dear to our hearts, right? With policymakers, like the last thing any lawmaker in the US wants is to be responsible for driving innovation away. Yeah. And in the meantime, there's just this like big messy middle ground, and we're all just like trying our best.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a complicated dance. But look, I think for those of us, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this too, but like we all knew something like this was coming, right? It just was a matter of when. Like I don't think anybody back in 2016 or 2017 was like, oh, we're never going to have to deal with or contend with regulation. The question was, how do we build all this out? And, what's the time and what's it going to look like? And I don't know if I think it looks so different than what I thought it was going to. So
I mean, we also could be biased given our legal training.
that's probably true.
Like, did I think in the year 2020, we would still sit here and watch the SEC basically dole out guidance via enforcement action? Like, I don't know. Like, I think it's been a little bit, like you said, stagnated, just like than I expected.
Yeah.
I had expected a little bit more, like everyone after the like Hinman speech, they were like, oh my God, like we're getting somewhere. They get it. Like they get decentralization. And then I just feel like we've taken like 10 steps back. And I understand it's a complicated dance. And I'm not in like these agencies' shoes. So like obviously from like the outside perspective, it's just been a little bit like disappointing.
Yeah, and in the US, I think it's really complicated because they just put out these ethics rules or this new ethics guidance a few months ago that said policymakers in DC can't be using or touching crypto. I don't know. Sorry, if you don't touch it, it's very hard to understand what it means and what it feels like and what it looks like, right? Especially when you're first doing it, taking crypto from an exchange, making sure you send it to your MetaMask wallet, making sure you plug your MetaMask wallet in where you want to, the amount of crypto goes through, like those few seconds when you see that it says processing the transaction, like that's an important experience to have to think about how crypto works. And while we definitely do demos and we have done demos for a lot of different agencies and policymakers, I think that touching your computer and watching it go, like you don't understand the next generation of the internet unless you're actually participating in it.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's the aha moment that you need that we don't have right now.
Right.
Like, sure, buy it on an exchange and then like let's transfer it to a hardware wallet. And then you can see how much in control you actually are of your assets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, maybe educational workshops, including demos, just for anybody who engages with lawmakers. That's a good takeaway.
Test nets.
Yes, test nets, faucets, all that. That's all like important to understand. So last questions, and we're kind of switching gears a little bit because we've been focused so much of the substantial stuff, kind of turning more into your experience. So like, I know you started as a litigator, right?
Yeah.
For many, many years at one of the best law firms in the country. And then, transitioning now to like being on the GC side, on the crypto company side. What are some of the like biggest surprises?
I had at least a gentle entry into what it would be like to be a GC because I had done so much crypto work with so many smaller and, just startups for a long time because I was working in DeFi before we called it DeFi. And I was laughing with a founder about that last week, actually, when we were on a panel together. We were like, oh, we didn't even call it DeFi back then. So I think when you start working with startups generally, you can't give this, perfect white shoe law firm, like this is the way to do it. And you have to be perfect and you have to meet with it. You have to be a sort of a business-minded lawyer and a strategic thinker and give options. And I would say for anyone who goes from law firm life into being a GC, sort of the starkest surprise will be a couple things. One, you only have one client, which is great. And so you can triage a bit better. When you're in private practice, you have many clients, all of whom think they have the most important issue of the day. The other piece of it, though, is you can't only give one piece of advice. You have to give a spectrum of like, here are the risks that you're going to face. Here are the business things. And ultimately, you let the business people decide. And you have to really be an integrated member of the business team and watch how the software gets built and make sure that you're thinking strategically. And you can't just say like, that's too risky. We can't do that, right? Shutting down an idea, that's not a way to be a GC. Saying, let's discuss it so we understand what you want to do and how to build it out. That's great. And it's one of the things I value about Stani the most is like, he always wants to talk it through and understand it and be a good actor while still being just an amazing visionary and innovator. So
yeah, but that's how I know you're a great lawyer, because a good lawyer will say no, but a great lawyer will say, here are the couple options, here are the different types of risks. Let's figure it out.
Yeah.
And then maybe also the traveling component is a little surprising.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what company you're working for and what you're doing. But, crypto is global, so you have to be where it is, which is great and very fun. And for me, seeing and meeting our developers and just different people who are involved in the industry and watching it expand so much from when we first got into it, and it's pretty cool. So, definitely surprising, but very fun.
That's true. Well, okay, I think this is all we have for today. Make sure you check out Rebecca's EthCC talk, and we're going to make the Rebecca test trend. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on.
And thanks so much for having me. This was super fun.
Thank you all for tuning in to another episode from Season 2 of Cross-Chain Examination, hosted by Katherine Wu and presented by Archetype. If you like this episode, please give it a 5-star rating, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Also, make sure to check out Season 1. We have 10 episodes from awesome guests talking about all kinds of topics, from privacy and crypto to crypto regulation to many, many other topics that I care deeply about. Share this also with a friend, with a coworker, and maybe even family if you enjoyed it. And give us a follow on Twitter. We are at CrossChainPod. DM me, at me with any suggestions, guests you would like to hear, and anything else. Thank you so much again, and hope you tune in to our next one.